Welcome to another edition of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum where all voices matter. Our show today involves the interlocking issues of government finance policy and consumer confidence. As government continues to grapple with the fallout from a second wave of COVID and the economic disruption it entails, Canadian consumers are trying to assert their rights and interests. Joining us to discuss are Elliott Hughes, a senior advisor to Summa Strategies and a former tax and policy advisor to the federal government, and David Clement, no relation, the North American manager of the Consumer Choice Centre. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us here today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
David, first questions to you. You worked on issues such as plastics ban, airline consumer rights, and so forth. What is the state of consumer rights in Canada in this age of COVID?
So I think it's really a balance between consumer rights and consumer choice. And I think that those two go hand in hand. On the airline question, I think it's a huge disservice to Canadian consumers that the government is not enforcing the law and ensuring that airlines have to distribute refunds, which is their contractual obligation. Obviously, COVID is unprecedented. We're talking about a 100-year pandemic. But at the end of the day, there are some pretty clear laws that need to be followed in terms of how we respect those consumer purchases. And then on the flip side of that, when it comes to consumer choice, we have the issue of the plastics ban, which is an issue for a variety of reasons. The major issue is it seems quite odd that at this time in a pandemic when we've all been relying on these products to keep us safe, whether it's via PPE or the takeout food that we get, to go ahead and attempt to enact a ban. It seems heavy-handed and cruel to lay another blow on the restaurant and hospitality industry when obviously they are struggling immensely. So when it comes to consumer rights and consumer choice at the federal level, there isn't too much to celebrate.
Elliott, from your vantage point as a former financial policy advisor to the government and a tax advisor, what are the challenges that you see before decision makers currently?
Well, I think David has spoken very eloquently to the question that you put to him. I think the challenges facing the government right now are obviously how are we going to get the economy going once we get past the second wave and on the back end of COVID. That is a big, difficult question that governments across the globe are struggling with. The approach so far has been to do whatever it takes, in the words of the Prime Minister. So that means supporting Canadians and businesses. There's some quibbles around some of those decisions, but I think overall, generally speaking, Canadians have been pretty pleased with that approach. But in a way, the hard work starts now. The finance department and other departments are going to start making some decisions around what the budget's going to look like. We've got a fall statement coming up probably in a couple weeks' time. So the government needs to begin putting that picture together and the story together for Canadians on, well, we've done the hard work of getting to the point where we are today through the pandemic, but what's going to take us out of the pandemic? What's going to grow that economy? How are we going to start to address some of the job losses, the closing of businesses, the deficits that we're running, and get the economy going back again? So that should be, and I think it is, based on conversations that I've had, that's the big concern and the big area of focus for decision makers right now on Parliament Hill.
Yeah, we've got a minute left before the break, Elliott, but is that really what they're focused on? Because there has been some talk that they're still focused on the pandemic rather than the post-pandemic recovery.
They have to do both, frankly. They need to be thinking about the future and while also contemplating what's going on today and reacting to today. That's why the fall statement, I suspect, will be much more focused on the here and now, healthcare, supporting businesses and Canadians through this pandemic. But work is already underway around what that budget's going to be. That's going to be the recovery, the rebuild, and the building back better that you've heard out of both the PMO and the finance minister's office.
We're having a discussion with David Clement at the Consumer Choice Center and Elliot Hughes at Summa Strategies as we discuss consumers and tax policy. It's a whole show here about a number of different issues. Stay with us as we continue our conversation. And we're back here at Boom and Bust at the News Forum. I'm your host, Tony Clement, with David Clement. He's the manager of Consumer Choice Center. And Mr. Elliot Hughes, he's a senior advisor at Summa Strategies, a former advisor to the Trudeau government. Gentlemen, thanks for being on our program. Got a question for both of you. Consumers are also taxpayers, of course. Is it inevitable that they'll be paying more? And by more, I mean the cost of government is going up and up and up. And there's obviously a lot of talk about tax and fiscal policy. Elliot, what's your take on that?
The short answer is not in the short term, but likely over the long term. The government has made clear, and the Prime Minister has repeated this, that tax increases are not in the immediate agenda. That said, I think it would be foolish for us to discount the fact that taxes are likely to rise in the future. The question is going to be, what is the right tax mix? Where is it best for the taxes to fall? And is there a way that we can lessen the load on certain parts of certain parts of the economy and certain groups of people, and perhaps increase it on others? I think that's going to be the discussion that's going to be going on around the cabinet table. But again, nothing immediate. I would imagine you'll begin to start to hear hints of it, most likely in the budget of 2021.
David, what's your perspective on this issue?
Well, I think if we're talking about direct taxation on individuals, that might be correct. If we're talking about overall costs of the goods and services that we buy, I think it's clear that consumers are going to pay more, both as taxpayers and as consumers. I mean, the most recent announcement from the Trudeau government in regards to the regulations that they're going to apply for streaming services like Netflix. Now, those aren't taxes per se. Some of them are in the form of taxes in terms of what they're going to attempt to recuperate from these companies. But they also come with increased costs via Canadian content regulations, which I think are quite silly. I obviously want Canadian content to survive and thrive, but I don't see any point of making consumers pay via higher prices for Netflix so that they can fund at a higher rate than they already do Canadian content, which it's unclear whether Canadian consumers even want. So I think that there are a myriad of instances where consumers are going to pay more, both as consumers of different products, but also as taxpayers. It is nice to hear that the government doesn't want to ramp up direct taxation on individuals, but I think there's a much broader conversation to be had on that.
Yeah, David, do you have any thoughts about the upcoming economic statement? Things that you'd like to see or things that you're afraid of seeing?
So I would be afraid of seeing a huge bailout approach to our economic recovery. When we talk about how we can get out of this COVID recession, we have to realize the government can do two things to assist businesses. The first is it can get out of the way. And the second is that it can actually inject capital and money directly to businesses. I would like to see a pro-growth strategy that focuses on making sure all of our X's are checked in regards to getting out of the way before we have more conversations about transfers to business. And I think that has to be our approach moving forward, because as we dig ourselves out of COVID, it's really going to be growth dependent. The government's perspective on this in terms of direct taxation hints that they understand that. And so I would love to see a strategy that focuses on how do we get the government out of the way to let business thrive. And then after we've done that, we can have a conversation about direct transfers to businesses if those are necessary.
Are there any signals that you've seen so far that give you some hope?
No,
Okay.
unfortunately not. I mean, going back to the Netflix announcement, rather than allowing for growth, it seems like that the government is more set on sinking its teeth into profitable businesses, and it seems like they're more likely to replicate that approach in terms of regulation, coupled with their existing approach of assistance for business. And so I'm not too hopeful when it comes to what our long-term future is going to look like.
We're going to unpack that. Elliot, we're going to take a brief break. We are going to unpack a couple of things that David has said as well. Stay with us. We've got a great show still here, and we've got another couple of segments to go. So lots to talk about. Please stay with us. And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum with Mr. David Clement, no relation. He's the manager of the Consumer Choice Center. And Mr. Elliot Hughes, he's a senior advisor at Summa Strategy, former policy advisor to the Trudeau government. Gentlemen, thanks again for being here. Elliot, I wanted to give you a shot at talking a little bit about the announcement just recent from the government about regulation of platforms like Facebook and Netflix, and who's going to be paying for the Canadian content, those kinds of things. What's your sense of things, having been in government, on how this is flowing out?
Yeah, I mean, I think the story can't be written on this one just yet. I think David made some great points earlier on. Look, this is going to take a long time to play itself out. They've decided to give lots of power to the regulator. That's going to lead to regs and decisions and guidelines, and that potentially could end up in the courts at some point. So we're talking, years away. I think the key point to take away here is this is from the government's perspective. This is a campaign promise that they are following through on from the last mandate, and the report that they got back, the AO report, and this is them acting on that. So I think first off, that's them ticking a box. And I think what it does is, and this is important for, not to take this in too much of a political direction, but this is a nod to Quebec. And we know Quebec is going to be really important for this government if they are going to secure a majority at some point. And so the cultural discussion resonates particularly strongly in the province of Quebec, for obvious reasons that we can dive into. But, that's why the government is moving on this. You've got Minister Guilbeault, who's obviously from Quebec, who is leading the charge. And so this is an electoral play, and I think there is something there that they want to get out of it as well from the policy. But I think largely speaking, this is them meeting a campaign commitment and looking ahead to the next election and thinking about how are they going to secure the votes to get to that majority government.
David, I'd like to interject there, just because, it's a campaign commitment depending on what time frame we're looking at. Because Trudeau has said in the past, no, we are not implementing what he called as a Netflix tax. So I think it really depends. And then it also begs the question on Canadian content regs, and kind of divorced from the political conversation about Quebec. I think we have to ask ourselves, we already pay as taxpayers $1 billion to create Canadian content through the CBC. Is that not enough? Why are we trying to use the regulator to apply what I think are outdated regulations on new and innovative platforms that consumers love, that they especially love throughout the pandemic, for the purpose of appeasing maybe some cultural requests in Quebec? For me, that argument doesn't really sound convincing if that's the argument that the government's making. And I would point out that in the past, the Trudeau government and Trudeau himself has said that he wouldn't approach Netflix with a Netflix tax. And so it really leaves some questions as to whether consumers are priority number one for the Trudeau government in some of these decisions.
David, let me play devil's advocate just for a second. What about the leveling the playing field argument? For instance, Maple and Canadian content has been a requirement for radio stations for decades, and yet these new platforms don't have those requirements. So the traditional platforms are saying, why are we putting all this money into Canadian content when our biggest competitors aren't? Isn't that a valid argument?
Leveling the playing field is certainly a valid argument, and I would agree with you, and I would say we should get rid of those content regulations for the providers who currently have to pay them. That's a very simple solution to leveling the playing field that ultimately makes all of these platforms more consumer friendly. I mean, anybody who listens to the radio, as much as I may personally like Drake or Justin Bieber, or if I date myself going back, Avril Lavigne, it can get tiresome to hear radio stations try and hit their content requirements by replaying these same artists. And I think that Canadian content is good enough to stand on its own 2 feet. So yes, we can level the playing field, but I would argue we should go the other way.
Well, we're going to continue this discussion in the next segment. Gentlemen, stand by. David Clement, manager of Consumer Choice Centre, Elliott Hughes, senior advisor, Summa Strategies, will be with us for one more segment. Stay with us as we continue this important discussion. We're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, with David Clement, no relation, manager of the Consumer Choice Centre, and Elliott Hughes, senior advisor, Summa Strategies, former policy advisor to the Trudeau government. Elliott, I wanted to give you a shot at this first. As the government is grappling with the next economic statement and indeed the budget, what is the sweet spot in government on tax policy? And by that, I mean, you want to maintain your tax base, particularly as after it's being strained by all of the COVID rollout. And at the same time, you want to drive economic activity up rather than down. What sort of debate is going on in government on this?
It's a great question. And I think it's one that the government is going to struggle to find the answer to. I think governments for decades have struggled to find the right answer. The challenge that the government faces right now is, I think we've talked about this a little bit, there's this changing nature of work, taxation is changing, and some of the benefits, some of the tax credits, for example, and some of the tax expenditures that were put into place or are in place at the moment, don't really reflect where where business and where the economy is going these days. So at some point, whether it's in the next year, couple of years, my view is there's going to have to be a bit of a reassessment of the tax regime more broadly. When I was in the minister's office, I hesitated to go down this road because of the obviously, it's a political quagmire. But I think we've now gotten to a place where it's going to be unavoidable. I think a black swan event like COVID hit. We now need to find the right mix. We need to think about, are we got the right levels of taxation on individuals? What businesses do we want to support through taxation, and so on? So that discussion and that point you raised and that question is something that is evergreen and is constantly changing. And I think it's one that is going to have to be really tackled in a substantive way with a broader look around the economy, individual taxation, and where do we want to go as a country in terms of supporting certain industries.
David, thank you, Elliott. Very interesting argument there. David, picking up on what Elliott just said, from a consumer point of view, and maybe through your Consumer Choice Centre, maybe talk a little bit about that. How would you go about advancing consumer interests in this broad debate about taxation?
So I think really quick on taxation, I think the approach we need to do is, if I were advising the Trudeau government, would be step one, don't listen to the NDP. Don't implement a wealth tax and try and reverse any corporate tax decreases that we've had and all of the things that they're suggesting. I would suggest to go the other way with a pro-growth strategy. And if we're focused on where revenue is going to come from, I think we have to do a Chrétien-style review of government spending. This goes back to how the government spent prior to the pandemic, because we weren't in a particularly great fiscal position prior to COVID-19, and simplify the tax code. I think Elliot is right in terms of reevaluating tax credits. And there's a long history of boutique tax credits that have been used rightly or wrongly as carrots for voters. And I think we should maybe abandon that practice, simplify the tax code, which should also please those on the progressive side who gripe about, let's say, wealthy people being able to navigate their way around tax rates. And so I think that would be the approach. In terms of how we treat consumers, I think there are a lot of policies where we essentially soak consumers twice, through taxation and through inflated pricing. And I'll use one example, which I've spoken about before, is supply management. We just gave dairy farmers a ridiculous bailout for access in trade deals. That's taxpayer money, so that's something that you and I pay as consumers. And then we pay inflated prices at the grocery store because of the quota system and because of tariffs on international goods. And so if we were putting consumers first in terms of what our perspective is moving forward and how government 2.0 in a post-COVID era, I think we have to realize that we can't double down on consumers as taxpayers twice.
I'm afraid
we should reevaluate.
I'm afraid I know it's crazy to believe, but our time is up. Gentlemen, a very interesting discussion. We've got to have you back because there's more topics. But thank you for being here, and very, very interesting talk for our viewers. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.